We all think we know a person. We see the life they've built, the smile they wear, the way they show up in our world. We piece together a picture and we believe it's the whole story. But what if it wasn't? What if the person you thought you knew, the one you worked with, shared coffee with, admired from afar, had a life full of sacrifices you never, ever could have imagined? That's the question that hung in the air that day at Willowbrook Cemetery. The sun was shining, but nobody felt its warmth. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees, as if nature itself was whispering a secret. The crowd was a sea of black and gray, a mix of family, friends, colleagues, all the people who had come to say goodbye to a man named Arthur Wells. And by all accounts, Arthur was a good man, a great man even. He was known throughout the community for his charitable work, his generous donations, his warm, steady presence at every town event. His headstone, polished to a mirror shine, said it all, a life of service and sacrifice. It was a phrase everyone nodded at, of course they thought. That was Arthur. But in the middle of that solemn crowd, there was one person who didn't quite fit. She was an elderly black woman, standing quietly off to the side. She wore a simple, deep blue dress and a modest hat, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath it. In her hands, she held a single white lily. While people around her exchanged quiet, sad smiles and murmured their memories, she was silent, completely still. Her hands were steady, but if you looked into her eyes, you saw a universe of emotion. A weight of history that felt heavier than the casket itself. Most people didn't acknowledge her. A few gave her curious glances, wondering who she was, this stranger at the edge of their grief. She seemed separate, but there was a quiet dignity about her, a strength that was both commanding and humble. The pastor finished his final prayer, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The familiar words floated over the crowd. People began to shift, to think about heading back to their cars, back to their lives. But then she moved. With a slow, deliberate grace, she stepped forward. The crunch of gravel under her low heels was the only sound. One by one, the mourners noticed her, and a path silently opened for her through the crowd. All eyes were on this mysterious woman as she walked right up to the front, to the very edge of that dark, open hole in the earth. She paused for a long moment, looking down at Arthur's casket. It was a look of such profound, personal goodbye that it stole the breath from everyone watching. This wasn't a casual farewell from an acquaintance. This was something else entirely. Then she carefully, so carefully, placed the white lily on top of the polished wood. She turned to face all of them. Her gaze was calm, but it held a fire. "My name," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the quiet, "is Alice Munro." A ripple went through the crowd. Whispers. "Alice who?" "I doubt many of you know me," she continued, "but I knew Arthur." She let that hang in the air for just a beat, her eyes sweeping over their confused faces. "Better than anyone here." You could have heard a pin drop. The air grew thick, charged with a sudden, electric curiosity. Who was this woman? How could she possibly make such a claim? Alice's expression was resolute. "Before today ends," she said, her voice firm with promise, "you'll understand why I'm here. And you'll understand the Arthur Wells most of you never knew." The man they thought they knew was already starting to fade, and a new, unknown man was beginning to take his place. Alice took a slow, deep breath, her gaze drifting to the distant trees as if she was looking straight through them and into the past. "I met Arthur 50 years ago," she began, and her voice took on a different quality now. Softer, older. "It wasn't here in this beautiful, peaceful city. It was in Birmingham, Alabama. And it was a different world." You could feel the crowd lean in. Birmingham. The name itself carried a heavy historical weight. "Back then," Alice said, her voice tinged with a memory of old pain, "the world was divided by lines I wasn't allowed to cross. The idea of me, a black woman, standing here today at the funeral of a man like Arthur, in a cemetery like this, it would have been unthinkable, dangerous." She let that truth settle on them. The comfortable modern world of Willowbrook seemed to shrink a little. "Arthur was just a young man then," she continued, a faint, proud smile touching her lips. "And he was nothing like the polished, successful man you all describe. Oh no, he was a teacher, yes, but he was full of fire, a righteous fire. His heart wasn't just in the classroom, it was in the movement, the civil rights movement. A soft gasp escaped from a few people in the crowd. Arthur? In protests? In marches? That's where we crossed paths, Alice said. On the steps of a church, planning sit-ins, organizing for a future that felt like a distant dream. And let me tell you something. Her voice grew stronger. He wasn't just there to observe. He wasn't afraid. When they shouted hate, he stood his ground. When they made threats, he stood his ground. He stood beside me, a black woman, even when he knew it could cost him everything, his groom, his safety, his place in the world he came from. The image was so stark, so contrary to the Arthur they knew, the Arthur in a suit at a charity gala, the Arthur who donated to the library, that it was almost impossible to picture. We weren't just comrades in that fight, Alice said, and her voice softened, becoming deeply personal. We became friends, the deepest kind of friends. And then we became family. The family you choose. She looked out at them, and her eyes were shining with unshed tears. When the world was determined to tear us apart, we held on. He was there for me when I lost my sister, to the sheer ugly violence of those times. And I was there for him when his own family, his old friends, turned their backs on him for standing with us. We shared our food, our fears, our dreams. He called me his sister. In every way that truly mattered, that's what I was, his sister, even when he had to whisper it. The story was weaving a new tapestry in their minds. The threads of charity and kindness they all knew were now being intertwined with threads of struggle, danger, and a bond forged in a fire they had never seen. But what I'm telling you, Alice's voice grew firm again, isn't just a history lesson. It's about the man he became because of that fire. The sacrifices started early. She adjusted her simple hat, a small, nervous gesture that betrayed the strength in her voice. In 1967, she said, Arthur lost his teaching job. The official reason was conduct unbecoming an educator. But the real reason was that he went to a march in Selma. He believed in justice, and it cost him his livelihood. She described a scene they couldn't have imagined, a younger Arthur, packing his few belongings into a beat-up car, moving into a tiny one-bedroom house on the wrong side of town. Not the spacious home he would later own here in Willowbrook. He scraped by, tutoring kids for pennies, but he never, ever abandoned the fight. He never abandoned me. Her voice caught. There was a night, a terrible night. My house, they firebombed it. Because we were hosting planning meetings there. The crowd was utterly still, hanging on every word. In the middle of the night, with smoke still in the air, who showed up? Arthur, in his little car. He loaded me and my two young nephews into it, and he drove us to safety. He didn't hesitate. He knew the risk. He knew they could have been waiting for him too. But he came. She looked back at the casket, her expression a mixture of love and sorrow. That is who Arthur was, not the man in the tailored suit. He was the man who would walk through fire for the people he cared about. He was a man who carried scars most of you never saw. And then Alice did something that would change the feeling in the air completely. She reached into her small purse and pulled out a piece of paper folded and worn soft at the edges, yellowed with age. This, she said, holding it up for everyone to see, is a letter Arthur wrote to me. In 1972, I've kept it all these years. She unfolded it with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to watch. The paper crackled softly in the quiet cemetery. I want to read you just a part of it, she said, her voice beginning to tremble just a little. She cleared her throat and began to read. Alice, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back. Her voice broke on the last line, and she had to pause, pressing the letter to her chest for a moment to gather herself. All around her, people were openly crying now. The last of their suspicion was gone, washed away by the raw, beautiful truth of those words. She folded the letter away, a sacred artifact returned to its keeper. Arthur never turned his back on anyone, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, not even when it cost him everything. She looked out at the sea of tear-streaked faces, her own eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce intensity. And yet, she asked, her voice rising, how many of you here knew any of this? How many of you cared enough to ask? The question was like a physical blow. It hung in the air, heavy and accusing. But as the truth of Arthur's sacrifices sank in, as the guilt and shame began to bloom on the faces of the mourners, Alice took a deep breath. She had taken them to the past. She had shown them his heart. But she wasn't finished. The biggest secret, the one that would redefine everything they thought they knew about Arthur Wells, was still to come. The silence after Alice's question was deafening. It was a silence filled with the rustle of uncomfortable truths. People looked at their shoes, at the trees, anywhere but at each other. How could they not have known? How could the man they'd shared barbecues and board meetings with have carried this entire hidden world inside him? The polished, successful Arthur Wells they all described in their eulogies felt like a stranger now. A mask. The real man was here, in Alice's story, a man of fire and sacrifice. A man who knew what it was to be afraid, to be poor, to be hated for doing what was right. Alice let the silence do its work. She let them sit in that discomfort. Then she drew herself up, her gaze sweeping over them once more, not with anger now, but with a profound, heartbreaking resolve. There's one more truth about Arthur, she said, her voice low but clear as a bell, a truth none of you would have ever guessed. Yet it's the one that shaped everything he stood for, everything he became. You could feel the crowd tense, leaning in even further, bracing themselves. Arthur didn't just fight for others, Alice said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. He fought a private battle, a battle of the heart, every single day. For years he carried a secret that brought him both his greatest woe and his deepest pain. She paused, gathering the words for this, the most difficult revelation of all. Arthur was a father. A murmur, confused, rippled through the crowd. A father, but Arthur never married. He had no children. Everyone knew that. He had a son, Alice continued, her voice firm, cutting through the whispers. A beautiful, smart boy named David. And he loved that boy with every fiber of his being. But he couldn't openly claim him. He couldn't be the father he wanted to be in the light of day. Not because he was ashamed, never that, but because of the time and the place and because of who David's mother was. She let the implication hang in the air. The pieces began to click into place for the mourners. Alabama, the 1960s, a black woman standing before them telling this story. David's mother was a wonderful woman from our community, Alice said softly. A marriage, it just wasn't possible. Not then, not there, the world wasn't ready. So Arthur made a choice. He would love his son in the only way he could. Quietly, secretly, he paid for David's schooling. He wrote him letters every single week, full of advice and love and fatherly pride. He visited when he could under the cover of darkness, stealing moments that were more precious than gold. Tears were streaming down Alice's cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. I was there when David was born, she said, a true, radiant smile breaking through her sorrow. I was the first person Arthur called, and he made me a promise that day. He promised that his son would never, ever go without, that he would know his father's love, even if it was a quiet love, a hidden love. She looked out at the crowd, her expression a mixture of defiance and immense sadness. So when you saw Arthur working so hard, building his business, when you wondered why he never seemed to spend much on himself, this is where it went, to his son, to securing a future for the child he couldn't hold in public. The story was so profoundly sad, so full of a love that had been forced into the shadows, that it felt like the air had been squeezed from the cemetery. And then Alice delivered the final stunning blow. That boy, she said, her voice rising with a maternal pride, is a man now, a good man, shaped by his father's secret love. And Arthur didn't want him to be a secret anymore. She turned her head, looking toward the back of the crowd. David, she called out, her voice gentle but clear. It's time. And from the very back, a man stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet, commanding dignity in the way he moved. He wore a simple, dark suit, and his eyes, shining with tears, held a depth of emotion that mirrored Alice's. But it was his face, the set of his jaw, the shape of his brow that sent a collective silent shock through the mourners. It was Arthur's face. There was no denying it. The crowd parted for him as he walked slowly to the front. All eyes were on him, this living, breathing piece of Arthur Wells that none of them had known existed. He walked straight to Alice and he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of deep, familiar affection. "Thank you, Aunt Alice," he said, his voice deep and steady, though thick with emotion. "For everything." Alice reached up and covered his hand with hers, smiling up at him. "It was always my honor, son." Then David turned to face the crowd. He didn't look angry. He didn't look accusatory. He looked resolved, at peace. "My father," he began, and the words sounded both strange and wonderful coming from his mouth, "always told me that the measure of a person isn't what they leave behind in things. It's what they leave behind in people, in the lives they change." He looked over the stunned faces. "Standing here today, seeing all of you, I see that he left behind more than I ever could have imagined." The crowd seemed to collectively exhale. The guilt and shock began to slowly transform into something else. Awe. A deep, humbling awe for the complexity and the sheer, stubborn love of the man they had buried. But Alice had one last thing to share. A final gift from Arthur. 2 months before Arthur passed, she said, her arm now linked with David's, "He called me. His voice was weak, but his spirit was as strong as ever. He told me he was putting together a trust. Not for his estate, not for his name, but for the children in this community. For kids whose parents are struggling to put food on the table. For kids who are smart and full of potential, but are often overlooked. He wanted to make sure they had the opportunities he had to fight so hard for." David nodded, stepping forward to join his voice to hers. "That trust is real," he announced. "It's already been legally established. It's called the Wells Foundation, and it will provide scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorship for any child in this city who needs a helping hand. My father knew he wouldn't live to see it in action, but that didn't matter to him. What mattered was planting the seed." Alice looked around at everyone, her expression softening into one of final, gentle wisdom. "That was Arthur's greatest gift," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet reaching every single heart. "He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the applause. He just needed to know in his soul that he had done his part, that he had left this world a little kinder, a little fairer, a little more full of love than he found it." She took a final step toward the grave and placed her hand on the cool, polished stone, a life of service and sacrifice. "So now," she said, turning back to them one last time, "I leave you with this. How will you be remembered? Not for the house you lived in, or the car you drove, or the job title you earned, but for the lives you touched, for the love you gave, especially when it was hard, for the people you lifted up, when nobody else was watching." She gave a final, slow nod, her eyes meeting David's, sharing a lifetime of understanding in a single glance. "If Arthur taught us anything," Alice finished, her voice full of a quiet, powerful grace, "it's that a true legacy, a legacy that really matters. It isn't written in stone. It's written in the hearts of the people you were brave enough to love." A deep, peaceful silence fell over Willowbrook Cemetery. The story was complete. The secret was out. And as the mourners began to disperse, moving slowly toward their cars, they weren't just carrying grief with them. They were carrying a story. They were carrying a challenge. They were carrying the hidden, magnificent truth of Arthur Wells, a man who proved that the most powerful legacies are often the ones that were meant to remain unseen.